Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Debra and Peter are doing a podcast with Deborah Alcott-Tyler, Chief Executive of the Directory for Social Change, and me, Peter Wanler's general kind of bits and pieces person. And this is episode 60 of our podcast. Some people retire at 60. What do you think, Debs?
Well, you retired at 60, Peter. I've got to keep going until I'm 67 at least. And we were jokingly saying that Jose, who's the producer of our podcast, probably won't be able to retire till he's about 85 if the government carries on extending the age you get your pension.
Okay, so we've got to go on to at least 67 episodes, perhaps even longer. So how is Arthur? This is the big question everyone wants to know about. He'd had his operation and...
Yeah, well...
Arthur the Basset Hound we're talking about here for...
Arthur, my beloved Basset Hound. Well, it's not good news, really. I mean, the operation seemed to go quite well. And we sent a picture to the vet of the wound 3 days after the op. And she messaged back and said, that looks good now, because we weren't allowed to touch it at all. We just had to leave it be in case we accidentally knocked off scabs or what have you. And then she said, now you can, give it a gentle clean. And we tried to clean it, but we seemed to make it worse. So we were getting really stressed about that. So in the end, I said to Andy, look, why don't we go to the veterinary nurse and ask her to clean it for us? Because our local vet's just down the road. The hospital is about an hour away, but the vet's just down the road. And then she'll be confident, she'll know what to expect, etc. Anyway, so I took Arthur in yesterday to the vet, and the nurse looked, and then she went and got the vet, and then they came back and said it was so bad they'd have to sedate him to do it.
Oh.
So I was like, well, okay, that's fine. And then so I had to go away because obviously he was going to be in the vet for several hours. And then the vet then rang me about halfway through or just after the sedation started, when they started cleaning, to say that there was a build-up of fluid under the wound, and that had also got infected. So they had to put a drain in his ear to drain out all the fluid, and then put him on new antibiotics. But they've left the drain in. So we have to watch him really carefully for the next 3 days before we go back. And hopefully if it's all drained out, they'll then be able to have to sedate him again and take the drain out. But it's horrible. It's basically a big lump of plastic sewn into his ear with his own skin sewn over it to keep it in place.
Wow.
And he's not happy, bless him. And he's generally such a, joyful boy, really.
Yeah.
And he just accepts stuff. And I feel so bad. And I'm having to keep his it's not a cone we've got now because he just didn't get on with the cone. We've got this massive rubber ring thing around his neck so he can't scratch it or rub his head on the ground. And he tolerates it really well, really. He doesn't moan about it, but you can see he doesn't like it. And what it's like, Peter, with your cats, is like you can't explain to them what's going on. And they sort of look at you like, why are you doing this to me? Why do I have to wear this thing, And it's just awful. Anyway, so he's not doing great, but fingers crossed.
Oh,
this
dear.
Treatment will work.
Well, let's hope for positive news on episode 61.
Yes. Yeah. Poor boy. How about you? You're wearing a very mighty shirt, Peter.
Yes. So I'm fine, thank you. I mean, it's still raining every day down here, but I'm going to Blackpool at the weekend. So this is my Blackpool football shirt. So with the NSP, and for those who can actually see.
Sir Peter on the back.
Yes. So we did a lot of work in Blackpool and have lots of friends up there, and used to go fairly regularly, and I haven't been for over a year. And when I left the NSPCC, they gave me this shirt, and they also gave me a little kind of voucher, and it said 2 VIP tickets to a Blackpool football match of your choice. And I'm not sure they ever thought I would take them up on it, but
you have.
I thought, you know what? It's been so wet and so rainy, and I've got a kind of elderly uncle who lives up sort of north of Liverpool. So I thought, well, my brother and we could go and see my uncle, and in the margins go to a football match. So we're going to watch the might of the West Country, Plymouth Argyle, take on Blackpool on Saturday. And because we're VIPs, I won't be allowed to wear my football colours, but maybe on my brother and my night out on Valentine's Day in Blackpool,
yes,
I'll wear this shirt and have a few beers.
Choice of date, Peter, to avoid romancing Lady Wanless.
Not really, not really. I don't know what she makes of it, of us going away for a little kind of romantic brotherly weekend in Blackpool. But hey ho, that's what we're doing. So I wanted to make sure I still got the shirt, and I thought, you know what, I'll put it on for the podcast. So, what shall we talk about? I mean, it seems to me the whole nation is in a complete tizzy about who should resign for this, that, and the other. And I mean, okay, there are some big and serious issues and problems and challenges going on, and I wouldn't want to trivialize those for a minute. But it seems to me that there are so many newspaper articles and commentators who instantly, anything happens, says the person at the top should go, and kind of calls for the head. And it cannot be the case if every time someone takes a risk and it doesn't quite work, or every time something goes wrong, the person at the top is required to leave. Otherwise, we would have extremely risk-averse leaders, and who would be a leader in the first place? So I wondered if in your kind of meanderings through the kind of literature of writing about leadership and your own personal experiences, if you'd ever thought about a frame of reference for leaders, and perhaps for boards of trustees as well, about when should someone resign, when should they accept that this is noise and be resilient and fight on. So I thought that might be quite an interesting topic to debate.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a couple of things I want to say before I talk about frameworks. The first thing is that this is a classic example of victim blaming. You know, it's like the man who lied was Peter Mandelson, and he lied to everybody throughout most of his career. You know, he committed quite a lot of these appalling, I'm going to call them offences, during his time in government, which was like 14, 15, 20 odd years ago. And so, and we see that a lot. It's like when we say to victims of scammers, well, why did you fall for it? Instead of blaming the scammers. Or when we say to women, you shouldn't have worn your skirt that short, you were asking for it. You know, and I really loathe that. I loathe the fact that the person who fell for the lie is made out to be the bad one. And people say that we should have known better. Well, you know, I don't know about you, Peter, but I've made some really dodgy appointments in my time that in hindsight I've looked back and think, well, that was a mistake. I should have done that. I've fallen for, you know, people swinging the lead a bit. You know, of course I have, because I'm a human being and I trust people and stuff like that. So there's something about the victim blaming that I don't really like. But then this business about, you know, when should you resign? When I first came to DSC, it was about my second year in, I think it was. And we'd installed a new computer system. And what had happened was, as a result of that, we'd abandoned our old system, and the staff was supposed to be using the new system. But what happened was the new system wasn't working properly. Now, I knew this, you know, I've been told it wasn't working terribly well, but I was largely oblivious to the impact of that until my finance manager came to me and said, we haven't got enough cash in the bank to pay the salaries at the end of the month. And I was like, how is that possible? You know, we banked a lot of money each day. And then when I went and looked at it, I realised that what happened is that the new system wasn't working. The staff weren't using the old system, so we weren't sending out any invoices at all, and we hadn't sent any out for about 6 weeks. And so, well, anyway, but it was a huge crisis. And I remember calling my chair at the time, a chap called Paul Farmer, who listeners might know, he's the chief executive of Age UK now. And I can remember saying to him, look, you know, this has happened, it's on my watch. And I fully expected him to call for my resignation, because it was, you know, we literally could have closed down within a couple of weeks. It was that serious. And he said to me, no, he said, you oversaw the mess, you can oversee the fixing of it. You know, you don't get to run away from this. You need to stay and sort it out, which of course I did. And that's a thing for another time. Yeah. But I just remember that his thing was like, he sort of thought that if you just resigned or got out of the way, that was like avoiding accountability in a way, that, you know, you didn't have to fix the problem that you'd either created or had overseen. And I've always thought there's something about that, isn't there? It's about, you know, if you get to resign, you get to not be accountable.
Yes.
You know, because there's no other comeback then. People can just be horrible about you, or you might get a bad reference, but it's not the same as actually having to roll up your sleeves and fix the mess either that you created or that you oversaw. Yes. And I think people forget that sometimes.
Interestingly, at Sussex County Cricket Club, the chief executive has gone and the chair went at the beginning of this week, and they're in a bit of a financial mess and they've been docked some points and so on. So it wasn't just Keir Starmer, it was on my mind. There's a number of sort but I think as a supporter, you might say that in that situation they had, I don't know what happened, but they had a sort of members meeting on Monday night, and it's quite difficult to have a conversation when both the chair and the chief executive have kind of gone. I mean, it's one sort of accountability for them to walk away. I mean, there are, without going into, there are different circumstances for each of those individuals, but with neither of them present, who is accountable? I had a line when I arrived at the NSPCC, which is one of these kind of cheesy ones that I'd heard other people say that someone says, "What's the role of the chief executive?" And I said it's to be accountable and responsible when things go wrong, and to share the credit when things go right. But if you are responsible for anything and everything that goes on in the charity, there are all sorts of things you can't possibly be across, aren't there? So it won't necessarily do the organisation good if each time something goes wrong, you're the one who walks away or takes responsibility. At the same time, I did feel an acute responsibility all the time I was there, that if, a child died in our care or whatever, despite knowing absolutely nothing about it, there's something about the person at the top being ultimately
visibly
responsible. So and that might, from beyond the organization, if trust is irreparably eroded in the organization, maybe even if the individual at the top knows nothing about it, it's their duty to go. So that would be looking at it through a kind of frame of institutional health rather than personal pride. But that feels rather unfair on the leader.
Well, it does to a certain degree. And, I mean, each situation is, as you quite rightly point out, Peter, distinct in its own way. But there's something about, lots of leaders are in fact risk averse, precisely because they're really worried about, are they going to be held accountable for things that weren't their fault? Secondly, is that the fear of having to, throw yourself on your sword means that it makes it much harder for leaders to trust others and to not be all over everything and interfering, etc. So that kind of threat is never helpful. The other thing is that it takes years. I mean, most organizations have problems and challenges. Any organization will have things that go wrong, and sometimes they're quite big things that go wrong. And that's just the way of the world. You can't always anticipate those things. And also, most organizations, especially larger ones, will have bad actors. They will have the Mandelsons who are untrustworthy but manage to convince everybody that they're, doing right. It's like, in cases of fraud in charities. It's is the chief executive really responsible for the fact that the treasurer was defrauding? Do you know what I mean? It's like it's all very, especially if they're plausible. So I think it's a tough one. I think if you can genuinely say that the chief executive or the leader, the chair, oversaw a culture of sloppiness, poor performance, etc., then I think that's reasonable if the culture isn't right. But it takes, as you know, Peter, it takes years to build the right sort of culture in an organisation, and it's very much a stop-start process. It's not a straightforward process. So, I think, I think if you can't, well, I come back to, if somebody lies to me, the person at fault is the liar, not me for believing them.
There's a difference between being responsible for things and being culpable for things.
That's great. What a brilliant distinction, responsible and culpable. That's brilliant.
No, okay, that I think that helps a bit. But then at what point are you culpable for excessive naivety in believing what you've been told? So, the Iraq War is a classic example. Tony Blair, when he arrived in 1997, huge amounts of trust. I'm just a regular sort of guy, you can trust me, I'm Tony, and all of that. And then in the end, he didn't resign as a consequence of the Iraq War, but his whole kind of premiership is now seen through that kind of prism of did he when he believed the advice that he was being given on going to war or not going to war, he was definitely responsible. Was he culpable? And in the end, we had huge public inquiries which determined that he wasn't. He wasn't culpable, but you know, you can't go through all those processes in a small charity. So again, working out if you're on the board of trustees and something bad goes wrong, how might you distinguish between responsibility and culpability?
Well, I actually think it's relatively straightforward, Peter, to be honest. It's about processes and checks. You know, if an organisation has appropriate processes and checks and balances in place and controls, for want of a better word, then you're very much less likely to end up being duped or end up being the victim of anything other. So, you know, if you're relatively competent and you make a mistake in appointing somebody, for example, I don't think you should, throw yourself on your sword for that. But if you're less likely, in other words, if I was a board of trustees and something had happened and we were looking at chief executive, the first thing I would do is say, well, tell me about the processes. Like, what were the checks?
Yeah.
You know, did you sign off that particular invoice? Who signed it off? You know, who monitors whether or not the proper decision tree is gone through and stuff like that? And they don't have to be heavy or complex. I mean, you know, really straightforward systems. And if you think about it, you think about employment tribunals, so often, even though the individual probably well deserved to be sacked, the company or the employer often loses the case because they didn't follow their own processes.
Yeah.
You know, so I would always be saying, you don't rely on individuals. You just can't, because individuals are fallible and they make mistakes, and we could be awesome and awful at the same time. Make sure that your chief executive is setting up for you, the board, robust systems and processes and habits of behaviour and, you know, ways of engagement that is known and written down and that you can ask about. That's the only way to deal with it. And I think if your chief exec makes a horrible mistake and then on investigation you discover that the systems and processes simply aren't fit for purpose, then fair enough, because they are supposed to oversee that. But making a walloping great mistake, you know, I mean, I've made loads of massive mistakes in my career, Peter. Massive.
Of course, haven't we all?
Yes, like embarrassingly huge, that I'd be ashamed to say out loud. You know, and like people are not perfect.
I mean, another thing which I think can be really useful in organisations, and you can dial it up or dial it down proportionately for tiny organisations right up to large organisations, is this notion of risk appetite. So you talked earlier about we need leaders who can take risks and speculate and push the boundaries and that sort of thing. In a child protection charity, we don't need them to be doing that with the fundamental safety of an individual child's life, but we do need them to do it when it comes to generating revenue and new fundraising opportunities or whatever. So if you can have a conversation as the board with the kind of executive and differentiate different areas of the organisation.
Where are your red lines?
Space, doesn't it?
Yeah, whereas you do not interfere with this at your peril, but this sort of thing, go ahead and play. Yeah, I completely agree. But it comes back to never just rely on individuals. We have this sort of culture in society generally, actually, about the great leader. And, you know, the leader's great and they're absolutely marvellous. And lots of leaders get given credit for good stuff in their organisations. I mean, I'm proud of DSC and I've been here a long time. But the reality is our culture is brilliant because all my managers are bought into it and all the staff are bought into it and everybody believes in it and they follow the same processes. If I was to disappear tomorrow, those processes would still be there unless the new person came in and said, let's not have one-to-ones or appraisals or, you know, leadership team meetings or whatever. So I think that, you know, a lot of it is to do with our own fault, and particularly with leaders in the public eye. You know, we expect them to be absolutely perfect. And also we don't look at the context in which they operate. I mean, I remember you, Peter, so like several times over the years where, you know, you've been gone after because a picture was taken of you that didn't give the right context. You know, I remember you holding the glass of champagne. Was it Jersey or Guernsey? I can't remember.
Jersey,
I remember that you were absolutely went after by the tabloids about that. And there was no context whatsoever. So anybody, you know, reading that but not following up on it would have immediately thought that you were, you know, a freeloader. You know, and of course, it's entirely not what happened. So I think you know we've got to get on, and it's very, you know, I actually genuinely do believe. I think it's very, very patriarchal of you that the leader is the one who's accountable for everything and make everything happen. It's very, you know, because actually women fall into that too. Of course, we take on those kind of leadership white charger stuff, but I think generally speaking, women have a much more collegiate approach to leadership. I mean, sweeping generalisation, I'm sure we'll get shed loads of comments about how very dare you sexist person, but you know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, it's convenient for headlines to call for someone's head, and it's easier to write a column than saying that than it is to make specific suggestions for reforms with particular timetables. And if we held commentators to account for the positions that they took, then quite a lot of them would have been fired a long time ago.
People want binary, not nuance, don't they? That's the biggest problem in society. We want absolutes, and the reality is the world is not absolute.
So, look, I had one other thing that caught my eye that I thought we could have a bit of a ding dong about this week, and that was the NCVO have put out quite a strong and thoughtful statement opposing this government idea that refugees and asylum seekers should be required to volunteer. Clue in the word volunteering, as a kind of condition of their staying in the country, and something that might accelerate their application being processed. And so I think significant numbers, hundreds of charities, have kind of come together and say, no, thank you very much. I kind of guess what you think about the idea of requiring people to volunteer, but were you part of this cabal? And I wondered if I might try and take the government side on it.
Well, interesting, because you're well done, NCBO, for doing it, of course, but it's not the first. We wrote a letter last year. You know, the sort of the sector wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister, I think it was, basically again challenging this suggestion by Shabana Mahmood was the one who suggested it. And why not? I mean, I can tell you all the reasons why it's one of the shittest ideas to ever be punted, Peter, if you want to hear it. You know, I mean, well, I've got to tell you anyway, because this really matters to me. So firstly, the whole principle of volunteering is that it's freely chosen. You do it because you care about the cause and you're interested in helping. And that's such a fundamental thing. There's something about once it becomes compulsory, and even though it's not compulsory, because all it means is you don't have to volunteer, but if you do, that'll be taken into account in your immigration status, then of course it becomes compulsory because you will feel you have to do it. So it's the motivation shifts from I want to help to I have to do this, otherwise I might be deported. So that's really, really poor. And I can't think of any charities who want those kind of volunteers. The other thing is it risks serious exploitation. Lots of immigrants, in particular migrants, into the country might well feel that they're put under pressure to be in places where they don't feel safe. You know, they won't know how to say no to what might appear to be excessive demands. Because let's be honest, charities can be very demanding of their volunteers and make volunteers feel quite guilty if they can't turn up and things like that. And they may, and actually, you know, bad actors in the sector, which there always are in every sector, you know, ours isn't exclusive to that, could use that sort of threat of, saying you don't volunteer as exploiting them. It's massively damages our independence. We're not an arm of the state, whatever anybody says. You know, we may serve the state in various different capacities, but to require us to carry out a state policy, which isn't really anything to do with charities particularly, because this isn't asylum-seeking charities or refugee charities. This will be all charities will be affected to this, is basically saying that we've got to gatekeep government policy. Never mind the cost, Peter. You know, can you imagine if you have to report, here are all my volunteers, this is their, here's their ethnic background, here's their, permit to stay. I mean, the cost would just be absolutely off the thing. It also creates, because the other thing about it as well is that volunteering opportunities are not evenly spread geographically. So what are the chances are you're going to have enough volunteering spaces in the place where you have a lot of migrants and refugees and so forth? And also, lots and lots of asylum seekers in particular come from really traumatic, terrible histories. And asking them to put themselves in, particularly with vulnerable people, for example, that surely can't be safe or can't be healthy. But the most important thing, I think, for me is about that it becomes forced labour. It's, I feel the same about community service. When they say you don't have to go to jail if you go and clean up a park or something. That's not volunteering either. That's forced labour, effectively. And so I just feel that volunteering is a gift, and it's something that I personally am humbled by the number of people who do it and give up their time to do it and do it really well. And I just don't. I just think the negatives about it are just so much.
Yeah.
I can't see it ever working.
Well, that's very powerful. I was glad that the NCVO noted in their statement that this didn't meet the principles of the famous covenant. So
Yeah.
the policy was announced, and then people were invited to say what they thought about it, rather than trying to work something up with civil society, because I have some sympathy with some of the motivations behind what I think the government might be trying to address here. Or if we were being charitable or constructive, civil society could play a much more significant part in helping out with. So we want, I think, lots of us, more people who come to this country to feel less isolated and to have a stronger sense of belonging. And you build belonging through participation and engagement with others. If people come to the country and they are dumped in these rather kind of stigmatizing hotels, and they're unable to work, and they're in this kind of limbo situation, that's terrible for their mental health and well-being. And to be actively doing something rather than unable to do anything feels positive. I think your observations about the vulnerability of many of these people are extremely well made, but there are charities and community groups that probably more than any other organizations do have the capability to be alive to and sensitive to that context, even if they're not beautifully matched geographically with where the people are. And so it did make me sort of wonder that if there was a really kind of grown up covenant inspired conversation between those in the sector who could articulate what our part of the nation could contribute in this space, and public policy makers who could acknowledge that and properly contextualize and fund the policy objectives they were hoping to achieve through this, then maybe somewhere in here there is something quite humane and better than what we have at the moment, which actually is failing refugees and asylum seekers, and is not helping the kind of wider debate to connect these people better with the mass of the population of the country.
I agree with all of that, Peter, apart from don't make it a condition of your immigration status. That's the issue. Of course, we want to work with refugees and asylum seekers to integrate them into society. And there are loads and loads of charities who literally do exactly that. They provide support, they create opportunities. I mean, one of my trustees is the chief executive of the Bike Project. And what they do is they refurbish bikes for refugees and asylum seekers so they can get about, because they don't get much money for, so it's about health, it's about transport, about all the rest of it. There are lots and lots and lots of organisations that already exist to do that. And if the trustees, if the government wants to make more of that, then release some funding, provide a pot of funding for charity to say, you are eligible for 10 grand if some of your volunteers are asylum seekers and refugees. All of that, cannot agree with that more. Totally agree. But it mustn't be a condition of their immigration status. It can't be, of course, in an interview, you might, as a refugee or asylum seeker, say, I have been, using this stuff, and that might be taken into account. But it shouldn't be, as a condition. Basically, you shouldn't be disadvantaged if you can't volunteer, because lots of people, Peter, can't volunteer for all sorts of very, very good reasons: trauma, language. They can't actually physically get to the place where the volunteering is. It's so. So I agree with everything you said, apart from it shouldn't be.
A condition.
It shouldn't be a condition. And also, there's always a part of me that says, why should civil society help the government to achieve any of its policy initiatives? We actually exist because governments fail over and over and over and over and over again. That's why we have a voluntary sector.
Yeah,
we're picking up the pieces, Yeah, but that might be a bit extreme.
I suppose I was trying to come at this as, could we, is there something here which the government, for good and bad reasons, wants to see change?
But they weren't doing it about integration, Peter. The government did not come and say, we want refugees and asylum seekers to integrate more, because they'd have been shot down by the right-wing press. They said, this is about how do we allow you to stay in our precious country. So if their motivation was that, then they would have said that. But it's not. Their motivation is actually quite the opposite. It's showing off to the public, particularly those of the public who have issues with refugees and asylum seekers. So I'm passing over you, but you can tell I feel very passionately about this.
Maybe and it's oversimplistic, but wouldn't it be great if civil society was showing the same confidence, aggression, tone of voice to assert what our strategic objectives were, which was to get the very best from the people in our country, to engage with their communities and inspire and celebrate one another and improve their mental health and well-being and get the best from one another.
Although, Peter, we do say that, it just falls on deaf ears because it hasn't got pounds attached to it. That's the problem. We do, lots of us do, lots and lots of charities point out how much good they do in communities, how they integrate, how they make people feel less isolated. It's just government doesn't hear it. Government, even this government, which really pisses me off, thinks that the sector is a bit light and fluffy and do-gooders and really nice and everybody generously helping each other. And it's so much more complex and darker than that in many ways.
Yeah. Well, I've been a bit sceptical about the covenant and whether it's going to change anything, and maybe it will, maybe it won't, but it feels like there's some big conversations here that if they took place before an earlier stage of policy making could lead to different places and reframing, but maybe it won't. So anyway, look, I think we're out of time. That's another half hour of our lives we won't get back.
Yeah, as it's being implemented. Listen, enjoy Blackpool, Peter.
I will.
I can't think of anything worse than having to sit through a game of football in the cold and wet, which it will probably be.
And then go for a romantic few drinks with my brother. On Valentine's Day.
You'd better leave your gorgeous wife a little card or a gift, something, Peter, before you go. I shall check to see whether there was any gesture of love to your wife you abandoned on Valentine's Day.
Well, we can check in again with one another next week, and then we're going to be taking a little break, but we can explain that when we're together next week.
Perfect. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks,
take
listeners.
care. Love to Arthur.